Team, can you believe we've made it to the end of our 8-week Quilt-Along? I can't remember a more dramatic 8 weeks in the world in my whole life. But we did it, and the whole time we were quilting. Or maybe you're joining me just recently, or maybe you are not watching this in April of 2020, but that is when it was filmed, and it's been a really, complicated time. And I'm happy we've been able to work on this. So the pattern was published in QuiltCon Magazine in February. I wrote it in September and October, and we have been working on our Scavenger Hunt quilt. The last 2 steps are name it and own it. So to name your quilt, give the quilt a title based on something you learned along your scavenger hunt. The title should be Scavenger Hunt, and then the thing that you learned. And to own it, you need to add a label to the back of your quilt. So in archival ink with a marker, make a handwritten label and applique it in place. It should include your quilt title, your name, the date. It should include that in the instructions for by Heidi Parks. If quilted by someone other than you, acknowledge them, and any other playful details that you'd like to add, or maybe just convenient details like your address and your phone number and the things they need to know if you submit your quilt to some kind of exhibition. So those are 2 simple steps, but there's a whole lot more that needs to happen as well. And I think maybe I feel some of those steps more than the average person because I have gone and made a job out of something that I love, which is quilting. But I think that it will be really helpful for everybody to learn about some of the additional steps that you might want to take. Sometimes I feel like at the end of making the quilt, getting to the point we're at right now, that is when the real work actually begins. So that could be its own 8-week series if I were being fully truthful with everyone. But in terms of this being our last week, there's a lot of exciting things that we can continue to do from here as well. So I want you to know that yesterday, I'm filming this on Thursday, so on Wednesday, I did a special event with the Makery, and I taught people a special embroidery technique, and I will continue to do some nice free events with the Makery, like this tutorial. We also did some hand yoga together. Later today, when this comes out on Friday, later that Friday, we will be meeting at 5 p.m. Central for a Zoom conversation. If you do not yet have the password and login for that, you can go in my stories on Instagram and find my newsletter stories, the archived newsletter stories, and in there you'll see a link to be able to view my newsletters on the internet just by searching them. So that will give you the password and details that you need to join our Zoom conversation, and we'll get into a lot more of these details. I will also be doing a hand yoga session for everybody to get started, so you get to do a little bit of yoga and relaxation to kick off our conversation. I am also, this upcoming weekend, Saturday and Sunday, teaching a workshop on Zoom. So it'll be a very small group, 12 people, and we'll make a quilt top together over 2 days. And I am planning a lot more of these workshops coming up because I lost about 90% of my planned work and income for the year, and I'm going to be shifting that to being online classes instead of in-person classes. And I think that for me, when I first began quilting, it was a very therapeutic thing. I had gone through a really difficult time in 2012, and 2013 was the moment when I started quilting, and it helped me heal so much. So I see a real need for quilting in the world right now, and to be able to offer an intimate class that has all of the sensitivity and feeling that an in-person class has. It feels really important to me right now. So that's the reason why there's small classes, why they're 2 days. I want it to be as similar to what you would get in person as possible. One of the most special things that happens in those classes is that each student gets to make a quilt that is uniquely their own. So they're not following a pattern. I'm introducing some techniques, some ways of thinking, and then guiding you through developing your own concept, your own meaningful quilt, and sharing some additional techniques based on the needs and interests of the people in the group. So I hope that you'll consider joining me. I'm hoping to offer things at a variety of time zone friendly times, both weekend and weekday, some possible topics depending on, especially if people comment and share what they're interested in. Let me know the time zone that you want. So think of your time zone and then figure out what that is in Central Time. It's the Chicago time zone, and put that in the comments. You can also request a subject. So I can do 1 day, 2 day, 3 day classes. I could do something, for example, that meets every Wednesday for a month. We can get into quilt tops, quilting, machine piecing is possible, although maybe a little noisy, and certainly I'm a little more passionate lately about hand piecing, but I'm good at both, and I have certainly done a lot of teaching of both. We can also do mending clothing. That's something that I really love to share about and plan to get into in the future. So those are some things to look forward to. Also, I've begun a new quilt. So this is a quilt that I'm making as part of the 100 Days project, and every day I am adding a new thing to my quilt surface. And so hopefully you notice the connection between this plant that I appliqued and embroidered and this plant that's been in a lot of my shots. That's a gift that my mom gave me many years ago, and that was in our shared home for a long time before that. So it always feels like a special living thing that I get to have that's from my mom. The 100 Days project has been fun for me. It might be fun for you. It's still in the early stages. We're on day 11, 12, 13, 14. Around 15 or 16 is the date that we're on for the 100 Days project. And as we move on to some other things related to the Scavenger Hunt quilt, you'll see that this is the first version of the quilt that I did. And here on the back is my label. Well, oops, the internet doesn't need my whole address and cell phone, but maybe this is an opportunity to show you that I use a different visible applique stitch when I am applying things like my label and also my sleeve. You can see here that I've used the ladder stitch for that as well. So it's a beautiful different stitch. It is something that will be covered in my visible hand piecing classes, and it's a different way of appliquing that I love. And you can see it looks very different from the running stitch applique that was used on the front of the quilt and in the directions for this quilt. Here you can see I have the title, Scavenger Hunt. I listened and I have appliqued that in place. And I felt like in this quilt I learned a little something about listening, and it felt appropriate with the rabbit ears that are on the bottom of the quilt. I also added a sleeve to the back. So in the quilting business, this is called a 4-inch sleeve, and especially if you are submitting your quilt for exhibition, you'll be asked to have a 4-inch sleeve on it. Something that is pretty unique about my quilts. Most people will do just one big long sleeve that goes across, but I always like to have a little gap on either end of my 4-inch sleeve. That is for hanging it. I put a wooden slat through the sleeve, and then when I hang it, the nails are here. I feel as though if the nails are at the end, that makes the wood that goes into that wooden slat is really fragile if it's that near to the edge. And if your sleeve doesn't go all the way to the edge, then it's quite likely that a little bit of your quilt corner might flop down on you. So this is the design that I always use for my 4-inch sleeve. It's very easy to look up online. There's so many 4-inch sleeve tutorials that are all good. So that can be a great thing to add to the quilt. And here is my finished, fully quilted new version of my Scavenger Hunt quilt. So I'm very excited about how that turned out. And I will be adding a label down here as well. Apart from titling and labeling and adding a 4-inch sleeve to a quilt, there are many more jobs that need doing. One job is photographing your quilt. Being that our quilts are pretty small, they are easier to photograph than an average quilt. One option is with your 4-inch sleeve on to hang it on the wall and photograph it. Another option is to set it on the floor and hold your camera above it, maybe even stand on a sturdy chair so that you can get your camera above it and take a picture. You would either want to have an attractive background behind it, or you might want to use Adobe Photoshop and use the polygonal lasso tool to go around and find the border. Then you would select the inverse, you would delete that background, and then insert a new background. And I would just copy the color from the background of someone that you respect to get their shade of white, because usually you don't want the absolute brightest shade of white. You want something just a little bit softer than that in the white category. I use Adobe Photoshop because I need it all the time for my job, but there are other applications that I'm sure you can find that would allow you to do that minimal amount of editing. Also, huge shout out to my friend Nancy Purvis. She is offering some really, really reasonable photo editing for quilts. So if you were to take a picture of your quilt from above and then send it to her, she could go in and edit out the background for you and also touch up any light or shadows. And I highly recommend her. I think that she is both affordable and talented. And that is Nancy Purvis, and I will be tagging her in this post. After you have taken a photograph of your quilt at a distance, that's not the only time that you should be posting it online. If you want people to start to be familiar with your work and to fall in love with it, all of you have been doing an amazing job of posting photos of your work as you make it, and that's a big Instagram tip. But also to celebrate a quilt after it's made, it's helpful to take a variety of photos. So you might want to take a photo of your quilt folded up. You can also take some beautiful close-up photos. If you want to be really fancy, you can get a prime lens to attach to a fancy camera, and that'll give you that beautiful blurred out background and the speckly dots coming from your quilt, and that's the most special. Or something that I have my eye on that I would love to purchase at some point is a macro lens. My brother, Jeff Parks, is a very talented photographer, although he does not specialize in editing quilt photos, but he takes photos for me, and when he uses his prime lens for the his macro lens for the close-ups, that just shows every stitch, every detail. It's so beautiful and special. I cannot wait to be able to leave my house and go to my brother's house and get caught up on taking photos of my quilts and snuggling my nephews. When you are taking pictures of your quilts, it's also a really special, beautiful trend within the quilt world to photograph your quilt out in nature. So you might hold your quilt up in front of you, something small like this. Maybe you would hold it an arm's length in front of your face. A larger quilt you might hold so that it's touching your body. But to play with how far or close you hold the quilt so that you either include your face or you don't include your face. You know, the amount of your legs and your body that's in the photo can be fun to play with. Also, the amount of wind that you allow in the photo can be really fun, especially if there's something that inspired your quilt. So for example, your nature element, if that included something in nature that you can find and photograph your quilt near, the same way that I'm making this video with this plant next to the plant that inspired it, that would just be a tremendous photo to be able to share more about why that thing in nature is so special to you. You can also lay your quilt down in nature. Certainly you want to be careful of things that could make your quilt messy, but it is just the back of the quilt that would be touching things. And so setting your quilt down on top of grass, on top of sand, on top of like a mosaic floor or bricks or some kind of special ground, that is a really beautiful thing to do. And then you don't need Adobe Photoshop or special editing. You're able to add something special with the background that's underneath your quilt in the photo. After you have a good photo of your quilt, you can post that photo on the internet. Having a website like mine, I use Squarespace, that costs money, and it depends on how much you want to invest in all of that business. But you can also do something like a blog. So I have I haven't updated it in a very long time, but I have a blog on Blogspot. And when I first transitioned from painting, I just started painting and then I moved into quilting. And so it marks this beautiful moment in my life where I became a really transformed from being a high school art teacher to being a full-time artist, and that is available to read through and look at on Blogspot. It's Heidi Parks Art at blogspot.com, and things like that are free, so I don't have to pay any money to have that up, and you could go in and post photos of your quilt on that blog. It's nice to have your Instagram link to something outside of Instagram and to be able to share more words, more of a story, to invite people in to learn a little bit more about your quilt. So having some sort of web presence that's your own, like a free blog space or a website, is a wonderful way to promote your quilt. You can also, once you have your photo of your quilt, you can apply to a quilt exhibition. Most exhibitions will ask if you used a pattern, and that does not disqualify you. There are lots of people who submit and exhibit quilts that were either made with a pattern or made in a workshop. And so long as you give credit, so long as you say, I made this with Heidi Parks's pattern, then you are able to submit that to an exhibition. Because it was published in QuiltCon Magazine, I would encourage you to submit your quilt for this upcoming February 2021 QuiltCon applications. If this upcoming year is like the last ones, and who knows, this is a weird year, but traditionally the end of November is the due date for applying to exhibit a quilt at QuiltCon, and it's usually $15 per quilt. And you can get a maximum of 5 quilts in the exhibition, and you can submit as many quilts as you want to pay for. So that is one opportunity to exhibit your quilt. There are also lots of other quilt exhibitions within the quilt world, and so Googling the names of different cities and quilt exhibition or quilt festival or quilt conference, that will pop up a lot of great opportunities to share your work, especially local things. So I could, for example, look up Milwaukee, Wisconsin quilt exhibitions, and there would be wonderful opportunities to show my work and submit to local things that would come up with that search. You can also submit to a magazine. For example, You could submit to QuiltCon Magazine. There's a moment every year where you can submit to write an article. That's what I did, and that's how I got to have my article in the magazine. So if you were to submit and say, hey, I want to write an article about my experience participating in Heidi's Quilt-Along, that's something that you could apply to do. You could also exhibit work outside of the quilt world. I think this is a really important thing, to get quilts seen by a variety of people instead of just seen by quilters, because we're already sold on how awesome quilts are. So you might have a local art gallery or art exhibition space. I know that when I was early in my career, I was in Naperville, Illinois, and we had the Naperville Art League, and I was able to exhibit a lot of art at my local art league, and I won some awards that way and was able to connect with a wider community of artists. There are also opportunities for anybody to exhibit with a gallery or participate in the art world or the gallery world, and a great way to begin that is to just start attending art exhibitions. So you don't want to come in cold to a gallery that you've never been to before when they're having an opening and trying to sell things and make money and say, hi, I'm new, I want to sell things with you. That's not quite the appropriate way to do it. What you do want to do is attend an opening, get a flavor for the gallery, and try to go to several art galleries and exhibitions and start to notice, which ones resonate with you and your style. Those will be the ones that have a lot of art that you like in them, compared to the other ones that maybe aren't as good of a fit. Once you've seen a few art galleries, art exhibition spaces, then you can come to them, usually with an email or during off hours. So if you look at the open hours for the gallery and you can see, they're probably busy Friday night, but if they're open on Thursday during the day, there are probably not many people there. And that would be a wonderful time to go in and strike up a bit more of a relationship with a gallerist, and then start to say that you make art and you would be really interested in the opportunity to show it to them. That's something that you would want to either schedule an appointment with them to show them your art, or have permission to send them an email with images of your art. So don't walk in cold with a suitcase full of quilts and expect them to stop everything and look at those for you. It's kind of a delicate process, and you want to be polite and respectful of their time as you gently make a connection with them. There are also, the same way that there are calls to exhibit quilts, like QuiltCon, there are calls to exhibit art in the art world. There's a Call for Art website, and that will have a lot of opportunities to exhibit work where, again, there is a small fee to apply. Usually an expensive fee would be $40, and it's possible that they could be less than that. Again, locally, there's a wonderful space called Woman Made Art Gallery, and they have usually a $30 fee to apply and exhibit. And I've applied before, I haven't gotten in yet, but people like my friend Laura Hartrick have gotten their quilts exhibited there. And it's a wonderful, beautiful gallery that I have enjoyed attending lectures there and looking at the art. So there are lots of opportunities, both within the quilt world and the art world, to work towards having your art exhibited and seen by a variety of people. Another step that happens after you have finished your quilt is the decision to either keep it and say that it is not for sale, the decision to gift your quilt to someone. I know there are a few people in our Quilt-Along who are making their quilts about someone special, either about their child or about their sister, and so maybe the quilt itself will be a gift to that person one day. You might, however, choose to sell this quilt or choose to sell other future quilts of yours, and for that you want to make sure that you are putting it at a price that is respectful of your time and talent. Certainly you are allowed to sell a quilt that was made with someone's pattern. So you used my pattern, you made a quilt. I'm saying now that you have permission to sell that quilt, even though it was made with my pattern. You put that work in it, and especially the nature of this quilt being so personal, you added something very unique to your version. If you are thinking of selling a quilt that's made with another quilter's pattern, you would want to read the fine print in that pattern. Some patterns request that you not sell them, that you just make them for personal use. Others say that it's fine. Technically, within the fabric world, there are lots of stores, like in Wisconsin, Kohl's, Kohl, is a relatively inexpensive department store. And when new lines come out from very fancy, thoughtful designers, they immediately buy clothing from those places, and they cut it up at the seams, and they trace the patterns, and then they sell those items that they make as though they were completely their own. That currently is 100% legal. That is how things in America with the law have worked out to be with patterns. So if you were to use someone's pattern, they really wouldn't be able to go after you the same way that Calvin Klein, for example, can't go after Kohl's for copying his design and remaking it. There is a different question apart from whether something is legal. Is the question, is it ethical? And so that's where you would want to think a little bit more thoughtfully about, is the pattern maker comfortable with you selling it, or advertising part of that as your own when it is their pattern that they designed and sold. So something interesting to know about legal versus ethical if you are using someone else's pattern. I think that there's, it's interesting, and it's really nice that there's a continuing conversation about what is and isn't allowed there. But if you are making a quilt and considering selling it, you will want to make sure that you are pricing it fairly. Another big looming issue in our world is pricing, and the quilt world, being a largely female world, is subject especially to the wage gap. And so generally women make 70 cents for every dollar that men make, and there's a huge number of reasons for them. One reason for that is that many things that women have historically done have been done for their family and have not had a price tag attached to them, versus many jobs that men have and do have for a long time been done outside of the home, and have therefore for a long time they've had a price associated with them. So it's easy for them to charge a particular amount because there's such a long history, for example, for the work of being a plumber. You don't just expect someone to do your plumbing for free, even though maybe that is historically a husband's job. I don't know. But because men do that, there are certain standards for what they should be able to charge. And a lot of times that kind of work is at least $50 an hour. So things that were done in the home by women usually did not have a price tag associated with them. Therefore, they have been thought of as free, or thought of as not having a lot of value. And there's an expectation to get it for free or close to free. And part of our job as women, once we know better, we can do better, as they say, that we need to start really thinking thoughtfully about what we're charging for our time and for our work. And if you're doing unskilled labor versus skilled labor, if it's your first quilt versus if it's your 20th quilt, you might charge something different. You would also, in that time, become faster at quilting. And I do not think that just because suddenly I've made 50 quilts and I can quilt faster, that doesn't mean suddenly the value of my quilts gets lower. I think that means at a certain point I decide what I charge per hour, and then that becomes what I charge on average per quilt. And if I'm able to make a quilt faster, then I'm able to earn more money, like a lot of jobs where experience equals more money and not less money because of an hourly rate that you've chosen, and then being able to make something more quickly. So one of my very first email newsletters broke down a lot about pricing and had some really thoughtful advice on that, and that again is in the archives of my email newsletter, and you would be able to look back and find that article and think a little more deeply about what you're pricing your work at. But remember that your time, your energy, your talent has value, and your quilt is worth a lot because you spent a lot of time and energy making it. All of our quilts that we made with this scavenger hunt, they are certainly worth far more than $100. So think about that and then think up depending on how much time you put into it. Apart from pricing, I had another thought on the tip of my tongue recently. So you exhibit your work, you photograph it, you price it, you have a website, maybe you write about your quilt. You might need to write an artist statement about the quilt where you can concisely, usually the challenge is getting a small number of words rather than a large number of words. But think about the words that resonate with you, the words that add value to the quilt, that describe your experience and your history as a maker. That can be really important as you apply to an exhibition or apply for an opportunity to share your work. The words that you choose in association with it are powerful and important, and it's been beautiful seeing people write in such really significant and thoughtful ways using the Scavenger Hunt Quilt hashtag. I feel like that is a strength that we already have, and I feel pretty confident that you're going to be able to write a great artist statement about your quilt. If you've made this quilt and you enjoyed it, the next natural step might be to begin working in a series and making more quilts. You could make this quilt pattern a second time. As you know, I've made 2 versions of the quilt pattern now, and I could see revisiting it again perhaps in September and making another version a year later to see where I'm at. Perhaps if I have a new different thing that I know I want to manifest, that because the first one worked so well, and I'm so happy with my boyfriend who I manifested making this quilt, maybe when there's something else that I really passionately want, maybe I would make another version of this quilt with that in mind to manifest, and perhaps that would be a healing and helpful process as I made another version of the quilt. You could also make another version of this Scavenger Hunt quilt pattern for someone else. So maybe you make it about a family member or a friend, or about your relationship with something specific. If we look back at my conversation that I recorded earlier with my friend Sarah Eichhorn, she made the quilt about her experience as a mother. And so that would be different from, for example, if later on she wanted to make this quilt pattern about her experience as an expert in fashion, or as someone who does urban homesteading and loves to plant and make her own food. So there are many different hats that we wear in our lives, and you could choose to put on a different hat to make a different version of this quilt about yourself. It could also be very interesting to make another quilt that would just be your own inspiration after this experience. So for example, maybe you would want to take just one block from the quilt and make a whole quilt about that. What would a quilt that is only the chronological block, what would that look like? What would that be? If you wanted to make a quilt that was just about tracing your body, what would that be? And how many times could you trace your body, and from how many angles? And would it be just your body, or would it be your body and someone else's body? Perhaps grandmother, mother, and child, babies, bodies. Those three bodies could be really interesting and fun and powerful to be able to trace all three bodies and have them in a quilt together. So any one of those blocks could be really powerful as a quilt all by itself. You might also have a jumping off point from your manifestation block, where there was something that you personally felt called to add to the quilt. And having that freedom, you were on training wheels with some of the other steps, and then you had the opportunity to do anything in the manifestation block, and maybe just continuing on making whatever you feel like making could be a now natural step after having done that manifestation block. So continuing your quilt practice and perhaps making a series, something ongoing, could be very powerful for you as well. So I look forward to talking to everybody later today after this is released on Friday. And also there's going to be another Zoom meeting on May 1st. So if we reach our 100-person maximum and it's full and you can't join on Friday evening, or if you just want to join twice, or if the time zone is more convenient for you, 10 a.m. Central Time on May 1st is another time that you could join the Zoom meeting about this. Remember, you could also take a Zoom workshop from me. Those will be coming out, especially highlighted in my email newsletter. And I have really enjoyed doing these instructional videos, and I would love to continue to make more instructional videos. They would probably be paid videos where you would pay to get the YouTube link to be able to watch them. And they would be, you know, somewhere between free, which this is, and my pricing that I have for my Zoom workshops, which currently for 2 days is $225. So, you know, somewhere in there is the spot where I will choose to price that based on valuing my time and talent and work, and the other comparable prices of things that I do, and the other comparable prices of things that are out in the world on the how-to video world, and certainly paying attention to the pricing of things that are historically male and things that are historically female, so that I make sure I'm not contributing to a wage gap in the pricing of an instructional quilting video, because again, we want to close that gap and lift up the work that women do. So, but also I'm really excited to do something that is a more accessible price. And so the same way that buying one copy of a book doesn't pay for writing the book, I'm so excited about the idea to be able to have something out there where many people paying for it pays for doing the thing itself. So anyways, it will be fun for me to figure out what that looks like and what kind of pricing structure and frequency it comes out in. But I have really enjoyed this, and especially love the results that you guys have been posting. So clearly the information in the videos is coming through, and that makes me so very happy. So enjoy putting your label on your quilt and naming it, and then doing all the other things that happen after you make a quilt. Thank you guys so much. I am forever grateful that you trusted me to make this quilt and shared your time and talent in making it. Thank you.